My conversation today is with astrologer, occultist, and author Jaime Paul Lamb. Jaime's work at the intersection of magic, Freemasonry, and astrology has been informative as well as transformative of the contemporary study of all the aforementioned fields. His enthusiasm, ability to articulate complex ideas, and depth of research and understanding of these topics make his works essential for any serious student of esotericism. We caught up on some topics including music, the harmony of the spheres, the current reemergence of esoteric traditionalism, and various ventures Jaime has recently been pursuing, some of which make him, in my estimation, one of the most intrepid practitioners in the public sphere today, as well as one of my favorite people to talk to. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation as much as I did. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanum Podcast. All right, man. So again, I want to thank you so much for coming on and for having a conversation with me tonight. It's something I've really been looking forward to for a while now. So glad we could sync it up.
Yeah, Ike, it's a pleasure. I really love the channel and what you're doing with it. So I'm really stoked for this conversation.
Yeah, man. Thank you. Thanks so much. So I guess I wanted to start off with your work has kind of taken on a very precise kind of scope at this point. You're very much so into astrology, particular Hellenistic astrology. I think you might even call it Daimonic astrology to a degree. And I remember taking a course just a few months ago at the Institute for Hermetic Studies, and you gave that astrology, natal astrology, and the diamond course, and it was super, super interesting. And I had read a bunch of your work before then, and I just didn't know until that point how involved in astrology you really were. And so I guess the question I never got to ask was there a particular event, book, teacher, experience that kind of inspired your esoteric studies in that direction?
Well, yeah, so we'll go back 11, 12 years ago when I first started poking around Freemasonry. And right after I was raised a Master Mason, I had the good fortune of coming into a copy of Robert Hewitt Brown's Stellar Theology and Masonic Astronomy. So previous to that, I had no real interest in astrology. In fact, I thought it was hippie garbage. You know, a lot of people, like my mom, liked astrology and she was a hippie. And, you know, you get these people like I'm a Leo or I'm a Sagittarius, and this simplistic, just like really just trite kind of perspective on it. And now, wait, I don't want to bash anybody. I'm not bashing modern astrology. Anyway, but so that had been my experience. And then I had a copy of Robert Hewitt Brown's book, which kind of was an astrological and astronomical and sort of cosmological interpretation of Masonic ritual. And I was familiarizing myself with Masonic ritual at that point, and it was perfect timing. I was 2 weeks after I was made a Master Mason. I got a copy of that book, and it just blew my mind. You know how you ever see that film, The Sixth Sense, with Bruce Willis?
Oh yeah.
So you know how you're watching that, and then all of a sudden his ring falls off, and then you realize, oh my God, this guy's been dead this whole time. You know, like I had no idea that was going to happen. I was blown away when I saw it.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I had that same feeling reading Robert Hewitt Brown, where it was like, what? Like the Hieramic tragedy and how it fits, and, you know, the astrological sort of underpinning of it. And I had to put that book down many times and just pace back and forth trying to fathom the gravity of these implications that he was laying down. So to get back to your question, like that's kind of the beginning of my astrological inquiry, although it wasn't serious until about maybe 3 years ago. 3 years ago, I decided to specialize. You know, as many of us in occult circles, you end up with a very, very broad but not so deep pond initially. You know, like everything is whatever is contained in Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages for a minute there, just this
Yeah.
shallow but broad um, uh, kind of pond. But in time, you end up, or I ended up, kind of refining my perspective and you know, refining my areas of interest and what I thought was fundamental, at least from my perspective. And I've come to think of astrology as being this cosmic mechanism that supports magic. It supports alchemy. Like you're not going to be doing, say, Paracelsian alchemy in the absence of planetary hours. You know,
Hmm.
so it's just really this, and same thing with magic, elections and things like that, and just the work with the daimon, like I've been getting into. You know, it's like this theurgical, this astro-theurgical work is really like, you know, its roots are in the cosmos, I think, or the relationship, the sympathetic relationship between the macrocosmos and microcosmos.
Yeah.
So, oh, and then you said what was there some sort of experience or some sort of like event? And there actually was. So about maybe 3 years ago, I was doing a lot of stargazing and just observing, naked eye observations. And I finally got this feeling. Up to that point, I was sort of had kind of at least one foot in the psychological model of, say, magic, you know, where everything's kind of like a projection of your, you know, almost a Kabbalianistic kind of um,
Right.
perspective, where everything's this mental projection and it's all very Kantian, you know. And then all of a sudden, and it was all of a sudden, it was like a flash where I felt like how colossally hubristic it is for me to think that these planets in signs and houses have no inherent meaning and purpose of their own other than that which I feel, you know, what I deem fit to bestow upon them. It just seemed like the most arrogant thing, you know, and I was embarrassed. And that finally, like, just opened me up to this vast cosmic mechanism, which is like I told you, I'm Greek Orthodox, but that's my religion, kind of. You know what I mean? Like
Right. Yeah.
it's all very cosmic, and it takes many different forms terrestrially, but it's just where I'm at right now, and this, who knows? Maybe this could change in a year.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, that's a beautiful sentiment to have. And in my experience, it's a species of true initiation, I think, to come to realizations like that. I think a huge part of what kind of holds a lot of practitioners back is this: they stay in this state of like, I'm going to dabble because it's too much for me to really relinquish myself to something that is utterly higher, utterly infinitely vaster than me. It's because it's not a comfortable feeling all the time. But I think that really, once you have that breakthrough, it's like there's just an understanding that you didn't have before. You know, it's of greater depth and therefore greater consequence. I feel like you're a better magician, you're a better person sometimes because of it. So that's really encouraging to hear.
Yeah, yeah, and
Thank
I'm
you
not
for
sure.
sharing that.
I'm really not sure what even kind of sequentially led up to that, but it was. I like the way you put it as initiatory because it absolutely felt that way. There was a liminal space through which I felt like I kind of passed at that point. I mean, it was palpable.
Mm.
Yeah.
So now, how did you, were you always, I know you were a musician, right? Previously for a while. I mean, you still play, but that's kind of like what you came up in. You were in punk rock bands and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I did a lot of music all through my life since I was 14 years old. I played bass in a band embarrassingly called Aborted Fetus. We were, isn't that ridiculous? We were a hardcore type of group, kind of a hardcore thrash group,
Mhm.
and had songs about Chernobyl and stuff like that. Typical 80s fare, imminent nuclear destruction, and all sorts of, just these hardcore punker stances on things. And
Yeah,
yeah, so that uh, developed into other interests in music, and as I got better at my instrument, I ended up playing a lot of jazz, and
right.
and I still play. I'm kind of a weekend warrior, but I've got a gigging lounge exotica band that I play guitar in, and I've been an organist in Masonic lodges for
That's awesome.
10 or 11 years. I've been playing
That's awesome.
organs. I'm master right now, master of my lodge now, but my default position is organist.
Yeah, I know just also from having a musical background, that there's a lot of cross pollination in terms of like aesthetic and the occult and stuff
Yeah.
like that. That's actually how I even became aware of the occult through music. So I was wondering if that did that kind of like catalyze your interest in in this particular subject, the occult, the esoteric, or did that kind of develop outside of that context?
Yeah, kind of outside. So they were sort of separate, but they ended up touching in certain places later, so it was only later that started seeking out things like the Graham Bond organization, or, these other sort of explicitly occulty music. But really, I think the most like occult, or let's say esoteric, um, music I can think of is liturgical pipe organ music. I mean, it's just so, and I don't even know whether to classify it as a cult or esoteric, but the most metaphysically meaty, I suppose, if that's not a paradox. But just, you know, there's something about the organization of sound. There's something so magical, but also a craft about it. It's so like uh it's so architectural. In fact, I think it was Novalis or maybe Goethe who said music is frozen architecture, or wait, architecture is frozen music. You ever hear that one?
Frozen music, right? Yes, yes. Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah, yeah. So things like ratio, proportion, harmony, symmetry, balance, rhythm, etc. All these criteria by which we judge the beautiful, by which we judge the good, by which we judge the true. These same criteria, and I think maybe that's the linchpin of the idea, is like the the criteria that we apply to our experiences in occultism, magically, alchemically, astrologically, are the same sort of, they apply to music as well. So music is a perfect little test tube, or a petri dish, or a sort of experiment, um,
right.
in which these vastly more cosmic ideas are represented in microcosm, like the music of the spheres, and you get into Pythagoras and all these ideas about celestial harmony and things.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I've the first episode I did actually was with a really great musician from Asheville, from this area where I live in North Carolina, and we touched on the idea of the muses and things like that, and these trance states that are almost kind of they are reminiscent of a kind of trance mediumship uh to a degree. But I do think that there's varying degrees of, I guess, like metaphysical fluency for a musician that is not as intentional as, say, when a magician is cultivating that kind of thing. But it's almost like these training wheels. I think that's why so many people that are involved with music, it's like I've been using this aspect of my psyche in this particular way for so long that to draw down inspiration and kind of just express something that is not expressible with words, right? I feel this way. I want you to feel it too. And you've been doing that for so long that it's just kind of just a few steps removed to start getting into ceremonial and or other states where you're involving psychism.
Exactly. So it is a language, as you were kind of alluding to. Like there are times when my wife is like, "What do you?" I'll just absently walk over to this nylon string guitar that I have in the corner, and I'll play something, and not a tune, just kind of a, looking for something. She's like, "What are you doing?" Well,
Mm.
these are things that can't be said in words, and this is the only language I know to express this particular species of idea. This is the only medium that will, at this point for me, at the period of gestation of whatever idea it is, this is the only medium that will accept it at this point. So it's like, that's really cool. Like it's
Yeah.
really cool knowing that language as a musician, that the rules basically, and what works, and modal theory and things like this. So it's like to have recourse to that other language, which in some instances is probably the perfect way to express certain ideas.
Yeah. And especially I think another thing that they have in common is, like you're saying, modal theories and things like, there's a lot of music theory that you don't have to learn to play, but at a certain point I feel like when you saturate yourself in that kind of a thing, even though it can be technical and it can be tedious, it just allows you more freedom to just let the music pour out of you. It's like you don't even have to think. I have so much freedom that this is part of me now. Even though
Yeah.
I put in all that work. So like traditions that we're involved in where there's a lot of rote memorization and I would say that there's a lot of people that don't understand why we have to go to those kinds of, I guess they would consider them extremes, just to do magic. But I would probably say that the analogy just holds true. The more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. Because really, it's a language, right? And I don't language becomes a part of you because it's constantly expressing you. Like I'm sitting here talking to you, and I don't have to like look at the alphabet to do that. It's
Right.
just happening.
Yeah, and it informs our thoughts, right? Obviously, that's been talked about vis-a-vis linguistics and things like that. Like I was just talking to somebody about this, how take the German language. The reason why you have a Wittgenstein or a Schopenhauer or a Nietzsche or a Heidegger or a Hegel, et cetera, the reason why you have this is because their language is so orderly. Like for instance, the word, I'm not sure if this is true, but let's say, for example, the word for doorknob is the round thing that you turn and opens the door. And it's like this, you know, 9 or 10 syllable long consonant choked monstrosity, but it's so mechanical. And German engineering, I think, is an expression of that as well. And German music, Bach, you know, all
Yeah,
basically everybody from a certain period.
right.
Buxtehude, my favorite, those two being my favorite organists, and they were organists. That's the instrument that they were proficient on. But
Yeah.
but yeah, so um so the where was I going with that?
We're talking about how it's a language and you can see that it influences thoughts too. It's not just a
Oh
one-way
yeah,
street. It's a
exactly.
two-way.
Yeah, the linguistic thing. So it's like, and the same thing with Greek. The reason, I think, part of the reason why you had such clarity in Aristotle and Plato, for example, is because, well, look at like the word time. We have the word time and we just variously apply it, sometimes very loosely. Whereas in Greek, or at least ancient Greek, you have chronos for sequential clock time. You have
Mhm.
kairos for the right time,
Right.
like almost an electional species of time. And then you have ion, right, which is this sort of precessional um, galactic time. So there's this gradation, uh, and it's in the language. Same thing with love. Love is such a slippery word in English, but when you break it down or parse it out into eros, philos, agape, etc., you get these nuances that are not available to us necessarily in English.
Yeah. And in some ways it can make it hard, I think, for people who don't understand, I guess, romance languages, maybe perhaps because I kind of find that there's that fluidity that in speech in a lot of those languages. It kind of makes it hard to translate and parse exactly what we're talking, what was being said. So it's always interesting to see the differences in that. It's the same way that people, I guess, interpret music differently, and
Hmm.
and uh, and 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 what kind of stylistic things that they prefer, they enjoy. But I know that you still play, and the specifically, I checked out some of the Jaime Caldia stuff that you've done, and it's anytime I'm writing, it's on for, it's somewhere on the playlist. It's excellent. But how do music and magic right now, how do they interact with one another in terms of your personal practice? Is that a thing that you spend time with?
Absolutely. So about 2 years ago, from astrology money that I'd just been putting in a PayPal account, every time I do like a natal reading or something like that, I just sock it away in this PayPal account. And um, and one day I was like, well, I knew that I wanted a harmonium because you can take it anywhere. It's a bellows operated reed instrument. So it's like a little organ. It's a reed organ essentially, but with a bellows on the back of it. So if you're not familiar, it's used a lot in Indian classical. You can pull out stops that give you drones. So you can play against a drone. So there's this nice sort of modal thing about it where you can, you know, get into the intervallic relationships against this tonic that is steady. And I ended up buying one of those with astrology money to use in my astrological work. So, and what I ended up working on was the intervallic relationships as they're expressed in like aspects in astrology. So when you
Mhm.
see any sort of astrological chart, the planets are arrayed on the zodiac, on the ecliptic, and they're usually separated by various distances. And some of these distances, or degrees of arc, some of these are harmonious, nice aspects like a trine or a sextile, and those have a relationship to intervallic relationships in music, right? You get squares, you get oppositions, and opposition, like an opposition 180 degrees would be a flat five interval. You know how dissonant that interval is,
Mhm.
and it matches the opposition in astrology, which is a dissonant aspect. If you have two planets in opposition 180 degrees apart, they are they are not in a harmonious relationship. There's problems there, there's miscommunication, etc. So it's a hard aspect, what they would call colloquially, but it's also a, a very unpleasant musical interval.
Mhm.
So they're pretty much one for one. I mean, it's all kind of a piece. So I found that getting this harmonium and starting to work on these correspondences, you know, s- certain tones with certain planets, or certain chords with certain planetary arrangements, or or certain modes, like the 7 church modes. Let's see, Ionian, Dorian, Lydian, Phrygian, um, Aeolian, Locrian, uh, Ionian. No, I think I missed Mixolydian in there.
Mixolydian. Yeah,
Yeah.
Mixolydian's the last.
So yeah, you get these 7 church modes, these plagal modes or authentic and plagal modes, and they can correspond to, according to certain tables, they correspond to the planets and various permutations. So I was working on a lot of that for a while and reading a lot of Jocelyn Godwin, who's done tremendous work on the harmony of the spheres and elucidating some of this Pythagorean heritage of music in philosophy, essentially. So I got a lot of mileage out of his work and put together some conclusions of my own and some insights of my own, and developed a system that I really like, that I can now play a person's natal chart, let's say. I offer it as a service on my website, actually, where I will give you a 5-minute recording of what the sound of your natal chart is, which I'm surprised I don't get more of those gigs, actually. I've only done like 5 of them over the last 2 years, but
Really? See,
yeah.
that I don't really geek out over stuff, but that is awesome. That is like ridiculously just mind-blowing, especially it's like it kind of almost goes back to what you were saying earlier about that moment that you had stargazing and this kind of realization. We take music for granted, when it's like this insane miracle, it's this miraculous experience, right? Because music doesn't happen in the external world, it happens in the mind,
Right.
which is, it's like, we take it for granted. That
Yeah.
kind of application is just, that's crazy to me. That sounds excellent.
Exactly. So air pressure waves that we're creating, yes, it happens in the mind. It's part of our sensation and perception, right? This chain of this causal chain of events that make music. But there's also I would argue, though, that it does happen in nature, but it just happens via different media. So like we said about architecture, so music does happen. And in fact, in the context of the medieval 7 liberal arts, when they meant music, so it goes, the quadrivium is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy.
Mm-hmm.
When they got to music, they were broadly talking about harmonia. They were talking about music that is not necessarily aural, Aural, I think is how you spell it.
Right.
Not necessarily sonic. Music is something that is in architecture, that it is in, let's say, woodworking, or it is in cooking.
Yeah, ratio, really. I
Yeah,
mean, that, when you boil it all down to, at least in its Pythagorean sense, it's the interaction of ratios,
yeah,
which that's such a cool idea, man. Just to do that, that's awesome.
yeah. Painting and in magic. Well, here's another project, a sneak peek at this project we've started working on. I don't know if I told you about this before, but we've picked, me and Ben Williams, a brother from Colorado, are doing this long-term project where we're reciting and recording the Orphic hymns at astrologically elected times. Like, for instance, we just captured Jupiter, who had a really great placement only for like a day. You know, um, he dipped back into Pisces. We were able to capture this moment, and I recorded I forget which mode goes with Jupiter. It might be Lydian, but no, it's one of the hypo modes. It's a plagal mode, hypo-Lydian maybe. But I recorded this 7-minute improvisation based on the modal and intervallic material for Jupiter, while Jupiter was in a very dignified position in the zodiac. And at that precise time, Ben was in Colorado in his great British accent. He's from England. In his great British accent, he did several takes of the recitation of the Thomas Taylor translation of the Orphic hymn to Jupiter. And so we're doing that for every planet. It's going to take a while, because if you miss a good election, like let's say with Jupiter, if we would have missed that very night, we would have had to wait until Jupiter was in, I think he'd have to be all the way in Cancer before we could get a good election. Sometimes you have to wait 10, 12 years
Yeah, it's
for a
wild.
good election.
Yeah.
So we've got a good Saturn one coming up. In case anybody wants to know, if you're doing any Saturn work, there's a great Saturn election coming up, and I'll tell you when it
Ooh, do
is.
tell. Do
So
tell.
there's a really great Saturn election, and this is in Phoenix, Arizona, so adjust to your longitude and latitude, but 8:09 a.m. on Saturday, January 28th. Saturday, January 28th, so 8 days from the time of this recording. At 8:09 a.m., there is a particularly strong and dignified Saturn placement. And it'll be the last one for a long time, because Saturn, his orbital period is like 29 years, basically. So
Yeah. Yep.
you're not
Yep.
going to get good elections for Saturn for a long while, you know?
That's incredible. I love the fact that you guys utilize the Orphic hymns too, man. It's incredible to me, especially, I'm of Greek heritage myself. It's just incredible to me how much, right? Because I guess in the mainstream astrology and magic, it kind of goes through these phases. And right now we seem to be in this kind of like neo-Hellenistic revival where it's coming out of academia too, which is
Mm-hmm.
really cool. It's really cool. Just lots of the Neoplatonic stuff getting re-explored, brought to the fore. Guys like you, guys like Chris Brennan,
P.D.
you know,
Newman.
right, and Demetra George just
Oh, yeah.
doing the Hellenistic astrology stuff,
Oh, right.
popularizing it. So what do you think? What do you think some of the causal, you know, triggers for that might be?
Well, I think I can express it microcosmically by saying myself in my studies, like for instance, I'm taking a Renaissance astrology course under Chris Warnock right now. So I find myself reading, like I read Tilliard's Elizabethan World Picture, just to get myself in that zone historically. And I've gone back to some of the Perso-Arabic medieval stuff and Guido Bonatti and these astrologers from around that time. But now, because of that, I felt like I had to go back to Aristotle. And I've been on an Aristotle kick for the last, realistically, 3 days. This is how these cycles kind of, work for me. And then I keep doubling back. And I always tell myself, I'm getting to the answer of the answer to your question, but I always keep telling myself, yeah, you got to buttress that with all this stuff that came before. So I think there's some of that, like where in the magical, occult, esoteric milieu, just generally academic and practitioner sides of things, where there is this traditionalist kind of movement, definitely in astrology, it's going on. And I think some of it has to do with this need to uh, buttress our understanding with a proper historical context and a proper a solid theoretical basis.
Right,
So
right,
as opposed to the loosey-goosey kind of last 100 years of theosophical new agey kind of, and again, not knocking that, but that there was not so much, I guess it's perennialism is what I'm trying to say.
right. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So
Yeah, I mean, I find that even in myself. I remember, so like 2 nights ago, I was giving a lecture on Zoom, and somebody jokingly said like something to the effect of like if you ask him one question, you're going to get 30 answers. And it really is kind of like that, almost like Wikipedia tab thing. And I see it a lot of people my age also kind of like coming up around the same time into magic. Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, it's like I need to know, and I need to feel like I have a firm foundation, because I have such a nominalist training by disposition, right? I grew up in this time, in this place, through the university system and stuff like that, that I know that there's a component of this that, they're called mysteries for a reason.
Hmm.
Right? Because any question, even if you're a scientist, any question, you can only have answers for so many questions. Eventually you get to a point where it's just, I don't know.
Yeah.
But the theory behind it really does, it expands it for me. It makes it exciting. It makes me feel confident in what I'm doing, and it makes things make more sense, I think, a lot of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's one of the things I like about the Golden Dawn tradition is its structure, that you do have the outer order grades, these elemental grades, where where you're exposed to Kabbalah, Hermeticism, some sort of Egyptian ideas. You're exposed to geomancy, astrology, alchemy, and you just get this broad kind of training. You're exposed to the pseudo Dionysian angelic hierarchies.
Hmm.
And it's woven into this really great system. So I think, and that's where you first really see the fruition of all these correspondences that had been coming together for years and years before then, and then they sort of bottleneck at the Golden Dawn for some reason. you
Hmm.
know um, the cipher manuscripts, I think, were that galvanizing element that was needed to really just. And then Mather's, of course, writing the ritual
Right.
and putting it in this quasi Masonic body. Um, but to see the collation of these ideas and the syncretism come to a full crystallization, um, and maybe that has something to do with, again, the new traditionalism, is that maybe we're undoing that. Could be maybe we're specializing, um, in an effort to extricate something that has been um, muddied somehow. Y-
Yes.
Maybe, and I'm just thinking this through right now. I didn't have a prepared answer for this, but
Yeah.
maybe we are sort of, maybe it's the opposite of where I was initially going with this, and in that our traditionalism may be this isolation of the constituent parts of the tradition that we've inherited as modern or postmodern magicians, let's say.
Mhm.
That we necessarily now have to go back and sort
Right.
of contextualize these things on their own and isolate them, and refine them as one would in an alchemical operation, right? You
Right.
separate and coagulate, and
Yeah. I think it's especially if you're a student of history or at all interested in it, I mean, it's such a fallacy to believe that, um you know, the scholars and academics and educated people, the great minds of the past, because it was before our time, that it was somehow misinformed, uh, in a way where it's not worth looking at or talking about anymore. And when you go back and you start researching some of these peoples and you start realizing how much of what we inherited just in terms of civilization is from these minds,
yeah.
then you start to realize that, like, there's got to be something there. These people were still brilliant regardless of whether or not they had access to a modern scientific vernacular or technology. But I think it's really interesting. One of the things that I had to figure out was how astrology made sense to me, because I was kind of like you. I was like, this all has to be some sort of psychological projection, and I didn't really get it. And to be honest with you, like I didn't even right. I've gone through the Golden Dawn. You're doing charts by hand and stuff like that over and over and over, like high volume. And I still didn't practice um until after your course, actually. Believe it or not, I didn't feel confident until I had that kind of basic how you delineate a chart that you gave us, that I became much more confident and started doing them regularly.
Yeah. You were talking about science and the kind of academic perspective, maybe, and how that relates to this practitioner perspective. And I just finished God's Philosophers by James Hannam, God's Philosophers. And it's basically the history of medieval science and how it informed the Renaissance, and how, of course, they dip heavily into scholasticism and Aquinas, and before, Aristotle and that Aristotelian kind of transmission. But it's interesting how how much worldview informs these things, and how, like, let's say for Freemasonry, um, an Elias Ashmole or an Ebenezer Sibley, these early speculative accepted Masons,
Mhm.
like Elias Ashmole was an astrologer. He was also William Lilly's patron. He supported William Lilly, the eminent British astrologer. And
Right.
it wasn't unusual for them to think in terms of the great chain of being, for example. it,
Mhm.
it was, in fact, what was on deck. And same thing when you read Shakespeare, Tennyson, Milton. All of these people understood that the sublunary sphere was composed of these four elements, and they were in a constant war of change and corruption and generation, and that there were seven etheric planetary spheres that concentrically enveloped one another, and beyond them was the sphere of the fixed stars and the zodiac against which they moved, and beyond that was the primum mobile, the unmoved mover.
Right.
So God was there and sent his emanations through the stars, through the stellar sphere, and then, kind of like as one would send a ball bearing in one of those pin games, coming
Mhm,
down
mhm.
where kind of tumbles through the pins. Um, that emanation coming, stellar emanation coming from the primum mobile, and then kind of knocking around the planets and taking on whatever characteristics or qualities, and then finally puncturing the sublunary sphere, and turning, you know made manifest in our uh, sphere of our elemental sphere of change and corruption. So, and magic, to me, I mean, magic, look at Agrippa's three books, look at the way that they're organized. So
Right. Yeah.
natural magic, celestial
Celestial.
magic,
Yeah.
super celestial magic, or angelic magic. So
Right.
they are literally that cosmology. So so I think that's another thing that I think is super important, is getting a handle on, even if you don't believe in that cosmological model, which I could argue that it's still valid even in the post-Copernican world, right? Even in this relativistic kind of whatever big bangy thing we have going on. I don't even know what you call it,
Mhm.
but I could argue that it still makes sense, because the earth is the locus of consciousness. We are
Right.
earthlings. Astrology is an earthly art. The perspective of observation is from the earth. The planets apparently move, on the ecliptic. They rise in the east diurnally, culminate in the south, set in the west. And that model is there. It's an experiential model. It's
Right.
there. And even things like retrograde, like I, for one, like what they call the Tychonic cosmology, which is Tycho Brahe's
Mhm.
cosmology, in that the sun has Mercury and Venus going around it. So the sun's doing like this, if you could see, with Mercury and Venus going around it. So that's why
Right.
you get these epicycles and deference and equiance and all these things that Ptolemy had to invent to make sense out of the math, but yeah. One last thing about worldview. Why
Yeah.
I brought up Masonry is that we talk about astrology, alchemy, and magic as if they are esoteric. They are decidedly Western esoterica, basically, right? Or whatever esoterica. They are occult arts, they are hermetic arts, they are esoteric. Well, before the Enlightenment, a very unfortunately named movement, or inaccurately named movement, before the Enlightenment, that was just science. Like before astrology was cleaved from astronomy, before alchemy was torn off of chemistry and thrown away,
Hmm.
before magic and technology were ripped asunder, when we lived, or people lived, in an enchanted cosmos that was the marriage of the quantifiable and the qualifiable. Now we're just left with this positivistic, nihilistic sort of world of weights and measures, a dead
Yeah.
clockwork that is disenchanted. And
Yeah.
it's that, to me, is one of the sadder things going on in the modern worldview, is this disenchantment.
I couldn't agree with you more. And perfectly said. The biggest thing in a lot of people come to things like the Golden Dawn, and you start out, you get involved with these magic groups, and a good percentage, in my experience, have been there because they want me to, or they want something, they want an experience, they want an order, they want a secret to be given to them that helps them kind of believe in everything that is magical, because how do you orient yourself to stuff like this coming out of our secular culture? It's all movie magic, it's Harry Potter wand waving, you don't really understand, but there's this idealism in order to pursue magic to a degree. And other than telling people, like, I can't make you believe anything, you don't come to these orders trying to find belief or find faith. But after you get through that kind of caveat, it's like, well, you have to relearn to but trust your subjective experience, right? We're constantly outsourcing the locus of authority,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
rather than you have to be able to, right? You don't die with the facts, you die with your life experience, and at the end of the day, you have to be able to trust that. And I think that's part of re-enchanting the world to a degree, forming your own one-to-one relationships with the things around you, instead of making these a priori judgments like, oh, that can't happen because according to this piece of paper, it's not supposed to be able to happen.
Right. Well, we're for better or worse, we're reaching a crisis, and that crisis is going to have to resolve one way or another, and we're pretty much there. I mean, you know read the papers, watch the news, whatever, the political milieu, etc. I mean, it's clear that we are in a post-truth society at this point,
Yeah.
so and that's one of the that's a transcendental truth, beauty, and goodness, right? So all these things, and same thing with like subjectivity in the arts. It's like that bugs me so much, is when people are like, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, or art is subjective. And it's like, fucking not really.
No,
You know,
no.
there are objective criteria by which we judge what's beautiful, and the same thing with the good and the true. There's this moral relativism. That's another one that's part of this crisis. I
Yeah.
guess it's a front of crises that we're up against, but we do we not find, as you mentioned earlier in our conversation, that all of a sudden there's this explosion of occultism?
Right.
Why do you think that is? I mean, it's
Yeah.
pretty clear why that is, because it's a response to the crisis.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is, It is, as it has been said before by several others. It really is, at its core. There's a meaning crisis here,
Yeah.
for sure. But yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of work to divest the modern consciousness, of all the, I guess, for lack of a better word, superfluities
Mm-hmm.
that are just piled on top of you. But I definitely find I have definitely found that astrology has really, right, something that mystified me for years. Astrology is definitely it's pulling me even further than I thought I could go.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a really beautiful experience. And I know that you're working on a manuscript. I don't know if you want to talk about it, but if you want to maybe give a teaser or something like that. If not.
No, I could talk about it. I'm in fact, my whole, like, a synopsis of my thesis is being published in the Mountain Astrologer in the Cancer 2023 issue. So this summer, I think I called that little synopsis, well, a 3,000 word synopsis. I called it um, Daimonic Astrology and uh, and something else. I forget what I called it, but I thought that was a flashy kind of name, Daimonic Astrology. That's
Yeah.
what it, you know. In fact, here's something that's kind of cool. If you Google Daimonic Astrology, like in quotations, I'm the only thing that comes up. Nobody has bit that yet. So I need to buy that domain name right away, because I
Yes.
think so. I'm the only thing that comes up, but anyway, and I've been blogging about it, I've been talking about it, and as you said, I'm working on this manuscript. So the idea is this, if you want me to just kind of uh spell that out real quick. The idea is that, according to Plato's myth of air, the soul stands outside of the cosmos, outside of causality, outside of fate, and the pre-incarnate human soul is coupled with a daimon, and the daimon is a tutelary, sort of guiding entity, a psychopomp and a mystagogue, and the daimon uh, conducts the soul through the mysteries of birth, life, death, and the afterlife. On its way down from this lofty place outside of the planets and fixed stars of the zodiac, the soul takes on characteristics corresponding to each of the 7 planets. So at Saturn, it takes on characteristics, at Jupiter, at Mars, and depending on the placement of those planets at that time that the soul is making its katabatic descent, um, it is taking on characteristics proportionate to the condition of that planet. So let's say Mars, for example. Let's say the soul is at the sphere of Mars on its way down to incarnation in the sublunary sphere. If Mars is fortunately placed, it will give his best significations, which might be bravery, courage, and valor. If Mars is neutrally placed, just sort of okay, he might give his neutral significations, middling significations, like separation and energy expansion or something like that.
Mhm.
If he is poorly placed, ill dignified, then the soul gets negative significations from Mars, which would be like violence, anger, aggression, etc. So now multiply that by 7, and you see what happens to the soul, according to Plato, according to Macrobius, according to Porphyry. You see what happens to the soul on its way down as it collects what Porphyry called astral garments,
Mhm.
and the soul is clothed in character. And character, as Heraclitus tells us, is fate. Character is fate. People tend to act within the confines of their inherent character. So if your inherent character in this model, this daimonic model, if your inherent character is sort of uh, composed of this reduction of planetary significations, then you are likely to act within the confines of that character profile.
Mm.
Hence, natal astrology's predictivity, because the proficient astrologer can look at the natal chart, see the condition of your planets at the time of birth, figure out whether they're, positive, neutral, or negative, and then kind of come up with a composite character profile, essentially,
Mhm.
not to psychologize it. But there is like provisions for psychological astrology going all the way back to the beginning of the art. So that's not a new thing. That's like not, that didn't start with Dane Rudyard
Right.
and Alan Leo. But anyway, so that's, and if character is fate, character is fate, because if people do act within the confines of their character, then you can sort of make predictions based on their planetary characteristics. So that's part of the battle. The soul has reached the sublunary sphere, where it is subject to High Marmini, it is subject to Tyche, it is subject to fate, fortune, destiny, etc. But in order to be liberated from fate, the soul must travel back up,
Right.
this cosmic return. So this is where the daimon comes back into the picture, because you see this in Plotinus, you definitely see it in Porphyry, you see it in Plato, right? All the
Yeah.
way back,
Yeah.
where this connection with the daimon, uh, or a personal genius, or a higher self, or a guardian angel, etc., or a perfect nature, as it's called in the Picatrix, the native subject of a natal chart hooks back up with this daimon, who can take it on the anagogic ascent back up, the anabatic anagogic ascent back through the spheres, and through astrotheurgy, essentially, right? Through planetary propitiation, through working with stellar configurations and elections, and and all manner of magic, right? So, like I was talking about that Orphic hymn project we're working on, this is why, because normally when people do planetary magic, they'll get, a white candle for the moon, they'll get, an orange candle for Mercury, a red candle for Mars, whatever, and they'll pick the appropriate day. Mars on a Tuesday at sunrise is a martial hour on a martial day. You burn your red candle, you recite the Orphic hymn to Mars, and you listen to um, Gustav Holst's Mars, right? That's what everybody does. So everybody's been listening to Holst. Every planetary magician, anybody who works with planetary magic, has been listening to Gustav Holst this whole time. And I will tell you that I don't believe that those are theoretically in, or I don't believe that he's using the proper modal correspondences. I don't even believe he has a lot of the general tenor of those planets,
Right.
uh, certainly not in key or timbre. But so the whole impetus for this project of recording the Orphic hymns is to provide planetary magicians, planetary astrotheurgists, with a real loaded, elected battery of musical power, to
Amazing.
you
Yeah.
burn the right fumigation, listen to the right music, recite the hymn with your heart. I mean, get into it, burn the candle, do all the stuff, stack the synthemata,
Mhm.
the Symbola and the Synthemata, and you're essentially erecting this ladder, right? And then work with the daimon, and then the daimon will, there's ways to get it, as you know from the class that I did. There's ways to derive the name of this entity. There's ways to derive its planetary affiliation, And once you get all these pieces, then the work happens, this theurgical work. I can go on and on about this. I tried to make it short.
No, it's amazing. Actually, what you just said about that whole thing, it reminds me of exactly why it pays to be like I guess quote unquote formally or classically trained ceremonialist, right? Because it's an idea that like, yeah, Holst probably sat with some of his ideas of the planets, and who knows, right? Maybe his output was affected by his character, the disposition of the planets as filtered through his microcosmic experience, right? And he puts something out there and that says this is definitively Mars, but it's Mars through Holst. Right. Whereas if you're a classically or formally trained magician, you can sort of attenuate or focus and hone in and create this, like, this is not, it's free of any of that kind of dilutement or permutation. We know what these correspondences are. We know through, tabulation, through experience, they're time tested. These correspondences work. So it's just going to add that oomph to everything. It's going to be a battery of power. And for anybody that has listened to my, somewhat maybe salty sounding rants about why you need to get into, this kind of ceremonial, I like the way that you were saying it, stacking, because it's the world of a difference. It's the difference between, well, I don't want to make any negative comparisons, but that is theurgy. What you're talking about is theurgy.
Right. Yeah, it's in the books. I mean, you could, these correspondences, and it doesn't stop with Plotinus and Iamblichus. You see it in Ficino. You see it in you see it in Christopher Warnock. This is somebody who's alive right now. Me and you. This is a living tradition. Yeah. This theurgical tradition is alive. And it's all over the GD. What do you think we're doing in the GD when we're working with our higher genius or the genius of the temple? We're animating statues like they did 4,000 years ago in Egypt.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, even in like the foundational documents of the flying rolls, I mean, the word theurgy or theurgia, it's referenced so many times, and I'm pretty sure it's either Westcott or Mathers, but one of them says like, that's what you're here to do. You're here to do theurgy. That's the purpose of the GD is theurgy.
Right. and it's, I mean, largely daimonic under another name. It's just genius. This work with the genius is work with the daimon. It's the same entity.
Right. That's how, I mean, that's because even when you see some of the translations of Plato's Republic myth of Ur, you see the word not diamond. They didn't leave the word diamond in. It says, he shall you shall not be paired with your genius. You will you will appoint your genius. So that word was the actual translation that they used to translate the word diamond. So it's all right there.
Right. Yeah. Plain as day. So reconstructing that mechanism, I think, is my project right now. It's not my project. I mean, personally, it's my project that I'm doing, but it's like our project. I mean, we're all doing that. And maybe this is another tributary to that urge of that pull of traditionalism, that we find this, Hellenistic, Greco-Roman kind of pull again, because now we need the real stuff now that we're at this crisis. We're at this crisis, as we've discussed, and it's like the difference between the magic that we may have inherited in the, say, mid 20th century and this magic today is the difference between a Tylenol 4 and a syringe full of heroin.
I love that. That's excellent. So there's a couple of questions that are pretty stock for when I do the podcast interviews, and I ask particularly two questions of everybody. The first one is, I want to know how you personally experience magic. How does it come through to you? What does it look like?
Okay, so magic, it's reminding me of something I recently read in Greer. Um, Sources of Magical Power. I forget what it was exactly called. It was a piece that he wrote for Austin Coppock's The Celestial Art anthology, and he wrote about sources of magical power. And my source changed, as I discussed a couple of years ago. My
Mhm.
source became sort of celestialized. So magic for me is is not so much magic for me is the theurgical variety, not so much magia or goetia.
Mhm.
It's become more theurgia. So
Mhm.
there's more. It's definitely astrological for me. That's just what I'm working with right now. And I keep saying, oh, astrology, this and that, and but there's a reason for that. I mean, that's just where I'm at the last couple of years, and I'm getting a lot of mileage, a lot of results, a lot of like a real visceral connection with the world and its events and phenomena and its relationship to the cosmos. That to me is that feeling that I had, that I told you about, that I shared with you, that this embarrassment of my arrogance, you know in the
Mhm. Mhm.
presence of something so mighty and vast, you know
Mhm.
and I brought up Greer because sources of magical power, how it's been psychological, astral, elemental. It always gets the locus of magic sort of moves or has moved throughout history.
Right.
So mine's heading back towards the primum mobile,
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, that place uh, beyond fate, um, liberated from this sort of generation and corruption.
Yeah. And I mean that we're talking about the times that we're living in and the crisis and stuff like that, and it almost seems like that's the only way to go. But the other question that I always ask is, so in any kind of media, I prefer books, but so would you care to list 3 books, blogs, courses, YouTube channels, whatever, that anybody listening to that you would to this podcast, you would recommend that they check this out to kind of get oriented or acquainted with some of the things that we've spoken about tonight?
Sure. Um, Quick grab would be Dorian Greenbaum's The Daimon in Hellenistic Astrology. But good luck with that, because if you can find it, it's $250
Oh
at
boy.
the cheapest. And it's a Brill title. And
Okay, now it makes sense.
yeah, a fat hardcover. I've got a copy. An astrological student of mine, or a client, wasn't even a student, a client of mine, gave it to me, you know, just gave me this book. So came out in, I want to say, 2013 or something like that. It could have even been 2016. But Dorian Greenbaum, The Daimon in Hellenistic Astrology, was great. Another one, well, of course, okay, a sort of keystone is William Lilly's Christian Astrology, 1646. You're likely going to get a classic reprint, or where all the S's are F's.
The facsimile copy, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I have. But believe me, you get used to that old typeset very quickly.
Yeah.
Like
Hmm.
those S's and F's, it's not a big deal. After like 4 or 5 sentences, you're acclimated. So
Hmm.
um it's 3 volumes, and you can get them in one. It's so handy for me. It's right here. Like, I
Hmm.
have this book around me quite a bit. Now I get cheap classic reprints and Kessinger's and these sort of things because I destroy books. I'm terrible with books. I write in them. I have so
Same.
much marginalia and highlighting, and I'm terrible to books. So I never buy expensive books.
Mhm.
So there's two. Let's see. A good third one might be, well, let me nod to my astrology teacher right now, Christopher, and it's very fitting for what we've been talking about. Christopher Warnock's Secrets of Planetary Magic, where he lays out essentially what we've been talking about, because he's squarely in our tradition, you know.
That's
And
awesome.
so Secrets of Planetary Magic by Christopher Warnock, Christian Astrology by William Lilly, and the Daimon and Hellenistic Astrology by Dorian Greenbaum.
Awesome. Yeah, we've talked quite a bit about astrology and exploring that from a traditional standpoint. So I guess at this point, you could mention some of the things that you're up to. I know that for anybody that's kind of hyped up about astrology at this point and maybe wants to take it a step further, you're giving a natal astrology course again, right?
Yes, so I'm through the Institute of Hermetic Studies, which is headed up by Mark Stavish. You know, a brilliant guy. Look him up if you don't know him. I'm sure you already, well, I know you know him, but the Institute of Hermetic Studies. Um, and he actually put me on the faculty. So I'm the I forget what he called me, something astrology, something astrologer. I'm not sure what, but anyway, Institute of Hermetic Studies, and the course, the course is going to be called Genethliology, um, something like Introduction to Natal Astrology, because
Mhm.
genethliology is the proper genethlioli. You do the Greek. It's like genethliology, genethliologia. Um, but Gen, like Genesis, you
Right.
know. So yeah, that's coming up. I can tell you. Oh, and I've got one other thing I'll tell you about that the Institute of Hermetic Studies is planning on doing at my behest. So I had this idea and I called up Mark Savish and I was like, you know what's something cool that we should do is I'll tell you in a second, but that starts in the astrology course starts in
That was my next question. When are they?
March 14th is when the natal astrology course starts. March 14th, and that is a Tuesday. So it's going to be every Tuesday for 6 Tuesdays in a row. So that's project number one at the Institute of Hermetic Studies that I'm involved in. My second project is I called up Mark Stavish and I was like, what if we were to do a course on Agrippa's 3 books, you know,
Oh,
where one person takes the first book, one person takes the second book, that'd be me, and somebody takes the third book. Mark would take the third book. Like, so we would get somebody to do the first book. Maybe you, why don't you hit him up? Or I could talk to him about you. You should be doing that.
sure, man. I mean, I actually I made my own annotations of all 3 of his books, but by the time I had gotten to the last one, I was a little tired. So
Yeah.
I mean that the natural magic book is fully annotated by me. So yeah, I would love to do that.
Yeah, I'll hook you guys up, or you're in touch with him already. Just tell him I told you about the project, and I'll do the same. I'll text him and be like, "Hey, I just talked to Ike Baker
Yeah,
about
perfect.
about about
Great.
it." So anyway, that's in the formative stages. So, but we're talking about middle of the year or maybe later part of 2023 doing the Agrippa
Awesome.
course. How's that sound? Pretty cool, huh?
That is a dream, dude, because most people just sit there in their studies like you and I and suffer through it. So it'd be
Right.
amazing to have that kind of foundation.
Yeah.
That's exciting to hear about, man.
Yeah. And
Awesome.
it's such a great, I mean, it's a comprehensive course, you
Yeah.
know, like Agrippa's 3 books are the comprehensive course. I mean, he was down with all the Neoplatonica, all the Hermetica. I mean, he had the whole edifice constructed. He had the proper worldview,
Yeah.
because what was he, mid 16th century, You know,
Yeah.
he didn't even know our positivism. He had no clue how much would go astray with our nihilism.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was trained by Trithemius, right? And he was 19 years old when he wrote those books.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and there was a period, I think it was 1533 when he did the first draft, I guess, and then 1556 or something by the time I forget the dates, but it was like
Yeah.
it was like a 30-year project.
Awesome, man. Yeah, that's going to be excellent. Have you got anything else that you want to mention before we close up?
I just want to say thank you very much for having me on. I love your show. I love your channel, and I'm keeping keeping tabs on you and all everything you got going on, and I really appreciate you asking me to come talk, and thank you for the incredible conversation.
Yeah, thank you, man. I anytime you want to have any kind of conversation, just hit me up. A lot of what I'm doing right now is because of the relationship that you and I have formed. And
Sure.
so, hats off and thank you for all of the inspiration, man. So I really appreciate it. And this has been great, dude. So
Thank you, brother. Let me know what you do with it and when I could see it.
absolutely.